So you're only as weak as your weakest link, and that's why in this video I'm going to be talking about addressing weak points. And I don't mean specifically weak muscles, although that's something I'd like to talk about in future. Rather I mean weak points within a given muscle. Because your muscle can be stronger at some points in the range of motion than in others, and it's by plugging these gaps that we can make ourselves far more dynamic and powerful and gain more control over our strength. And in particular I want to talk about something called end range strength, which is a cool concept that describes how much force you're able to exert when the muscle is in an elongated position. So you might think that you know what your 1 rep max is for a curl, for a bench press, for a squat, etc. But in truth, you're probably only actually using 100% effort in any given muscle at certain points during that range of motion, during the trajectory that you carry the weight through during that exercise. So a good example of this might be the bicep curl. That's a nice simple exercise. So right down at the bottom of the movement, your bicep actually gets something of a break. That's because the weight is hanging and your joint actually takes a fair amount of that weight. Then as you curl the weight upwards, you're changing the angle of resistance so that the actual involvement of different muscles is changing. Once you get up to the top, once again you're able to support that weight with your elbow joint, and thereby you're not using your bicep half as much as you would be at any other point during that motion. Moreover, if you're using a heavy weight in particular, chances are you're kind of exploding at the bottom of the movement, creating a sudden contraction, which is then propelling the weight upwards, meaning that momentum is actually carrying the weight through a certain portion of that movement. This is what we call the strength curve, and thanks to the strength curve, we can develop these kinds of weak points. If you imagine that you're doing this over and over again, and you're kind of skipping past certain points in that movement, then it's easy to imagine that there will be positions at which you eventually are not as strong as others. This is why if you're going to fail in a movement, you often get stuck in a certain position, maybe right at the bottom of the squat or maybe halfway through the bench press, because you're not used to exerting as much strength in that position. This is where you're weakest. And this is why training those things and fixing those weak points can make you stronger and more controlled throughout that entire movement. So that's the first thing we're going to address. How can we fix these kinds of weaknesses? Well, the first and most obvious thing you can do is to slow the movement right down and use a lighter weight. Instead of trying to skip past the parts that are difficult, instead of ego lifting, drop to a lower weight and really slow down that movement, not just through the eccentric, but also through the concentric. This is why I love quasi-isometric exercises, which are extremely slow push-ups and pull-ups, but you can likewise do the same thing with really slow bicep curls using light weights, or any other movement really using a light weight. Likewise, you might want to train a little bit more using things like cables. Cables are different because the angle of resistance, although different from what you'd use with a dumbbell or a bench press, can often remain the same. So for example, there are ways to perform a bicep curl using cables where the resistance is going to be the same all the way through the movement, or even greater at the points where it's usually weaker. So lower that weight and then slowly move through those range of motions with the exact same amount of resistance, forcing your muscles to work hard all the way through the exercise. Similarly, you can use bands. Bands don't have the same resistance all the way through, but they have a changing resistance. Just want to point out at this juncture that I'm not saying that using explosive movements and very heavy weights isn't a useful way to develop strength. I'm saying that you want both. You want that explosiveness and that kind of slow control. The other point of a movement where we're often weakest though, as I mentioned at the start of this video, is your end range. The end range is the point where the muscle is the most elongated. It's at this point, and also when it's at the shortest, that the muscle is the weakest. This is actually one of the reasons that we maintain a small amount of tension in our muscles throughout the day, called tonus. Because if our muscles completely relaxed and went completely elongated, then it would be much harder for us to move explosively when we suddenly need to. But sometimes you do need to be strong in those elongated positions. Sometimes you find yourself in a situation hanging from a cliff. This is something, again, that happens to me all the time. Hanging from a cliff, or perhaps blocking a punch at a very unusual angle, where the ability to exert strength at that strange position, that elongated, awkward position, comes in handy. This is why a lot of calisthenics moves look so awesome, like the Lalande push-up. The Lalande push-up looks gravity-defying because you need to have a rigid torso throughout the movement, but also because you're starting off in a position that's often the end point for a lot of other exercises with your arms stretched out over your head. So it's just this uncomfortable, strange position. And that's the first clue as to how we can train our end range strength. We do it using exercises that put us in those compromised positions, those elongated, stretched out positions. So the Lalande push-up is a great one, but another good example is anything that uses weight to actually help us get into that position, which is a form of weighted stretching. Tons of exercises do this. For example, a weighted Cossack squat forces you into that deep side lunge, which is excellent for strengthening yourself in that lower position, then you've got to get out of that position again. Same thing goes for Bulgarian split squats and all kinds of other exercises. A number of calisthenics movements also incorporate a really good end range of motion that goes beyond what you normally use, such as the V-sit, which of course trains that compressive strength. And a correction on my last video, the V-sit builds up to Mana, not Maltese, sorry, that was just a slip of the tongue. And this will build up more range of motion. Likewise, something like planche training that has your biceps in that locked out position and challenges you to use instead your scapula to push yourself a little bit further. This is the point where the biceps and the pecs pass the baton over to the back, and this is another way to train at ranges of motion that you're maybe not used to training. We can also take a lot of cues from calisthenics and different forms of mobility training, because end range strength has a lot to do with your mobility. So we tend to think of mobility as this kind of plasticity, this stretchiness of our muscles and our connective tissues. But of course that's not really what's going on. You don't get stretchier as you practice stretching. What actually happens is it's more to do with your nervous system, your ability to strengthen and contract the agonist muscles, the working muscles, and to relax the opposing antagonistic muscles that are trying to pull you back into that comfortable position. So as you try and reach that uncomfortable position, the muscles that are working get weaker as they reach the end range of their strength. Meanwhile, they have to pull against the antagonist muscles that are tightening up and tensing, thinking, hey, this isn't right. And eventually that strength just isn't there and you can't move any further. Mobility is different from flexibility. Flexibility is your ability to pull yourself into a position or to use an external object to get yourself in that position, whereas mobility is your ability to get there on your own. So mobility is far more useful in martial arts, in rock climbing, parkour, and of course in any form of training. Luckily, there are lots of ways we can increase this strength at the end range whilst at the same time gaining that control and that mobility. One example of this is something called a passive end range hold. Basically what this involves is getting yourself into a stretch position, a passive stretch, using some kind of external tool, whether that's a band, whether that's a bar or something. And then what you're going to do is going to let go and try and hold that position as best as you can from your own steam. So you might not have been able to get into that position on your own, but now you're going to try and hold that position, and that's going to train yourself to be able to do it again in future. It's essentially a form of overload training. Another similar strategy is something called a lift off. Get yourself into a stretch position with your shoulders, then you're going to gradually lift yourself off and hold your arms in that position. You can also practice overcoming isometrics in these positions. So get into the position where you're weak, where you're elongated, and then try and push against that position to go even further, using some kind of obstacle, some kind of object to force against yourself. So for example, you might lift your leg as high as you can, put your hand on top of it, and then try and push as hard as you can to go even higher. This also shows you just how little strength you have at that end range. Now imagine if you were able to drive more power into that position, how much more powerful your kicks might be. Similarly, try standing with your back against the wall, lifting your arms overhead, but then also pushing your hands against the wall to try and get them even further back. A tip when performing this is to contract your abs and to move the lower spine towards the floor or against the wall, and by doing this, you're preventing yourself from cheating essentially by bending your back instead of using that range of motion in the shoulders. Eventually you gain more strength and control in those end ranges, which not only helps you to exert more power in unusual positions, but at the same time helps you to move more freely and with less restriction. And this can even help to reduce the risk of injury because of course you're gaining more control and more strength right at the positions where you're the most vulnerable. Another point is when you're right at the top, the apex of the movement, really squeeze the working muscle. That way you're also exerting a lot of strength during the shortest, most compressed position that the muscle is in, which is also an area where we're normally very weak. Of course, make sure to ease yourself into this kind of training gently. Don't force yourself into positions that feel very uncomfortable or painful, and at the same time make sure that you're nice and warm before you start getting into those positions. So there you go guys, those are some ideas and some strategies you can use to strengthen your muscles at positions where they're normally the weakest. Let me know in the comments down below if you found this useful and what strategies you use to increase your end range strength and to address weak points in your range of motion. If you found this video useful and interesting, then please leave a like and share it around, that helps me out immensely. Subscribe if you want to see more like this, and if you like this kind of approach to training where we look at things that are maybe overlooked by the mainstream and focus on functional performance, then you'll probably like my ebook and training program, Super Functional Training. I'll leave a link to that in the description down below, and there's a discount on whilst we're all in lockdown. In that PDF ebook, I go into a lot more detail on a whole range of different training strategies that a lot of people just don't consider to try and develop a kind of comprehensive approach to strength, performance, mobility, endurance, even brain training. And then we tie it all up at the end with a training program that you can use at home, and there are versions that involve little equipment for those who don't have access to a gym right now. Alternatively, consider becoming a patron. If you do, then you'll gain access to some exclusive content, as well as an invitation to the Secret Pioneer Club on Facebook, where we discuss our training strategies, share things we find on the web, and generally talk about human performance. It's a cool community and I really love where it's headed, so I'd love to see you there. Whatever the case, thanks so much for watching this one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.